Well, I invite you to please turn in your copy of God's Word to Psalm 63. Psalm 63, as we continue our life-changing look at Jesus. Yes, we've gone a bit out of chronological order here, but there is a few things we need to consider this morning from Psalm 63. We won't look at the whole text. We'll consider most of it, and then we'll focus in on a certain section of it. As you turn to Psalm 63, I'm going to read verses 1 through 8, but before I read verse 1, I'm going to read the title of the psalm. You might remember a few years ago, Pastor Rick told us that these titles above verse 1 of each psalm is part of the original inspired text. Now, I'm not talking about the heading that your translation gives for each psalm. I'm talking about the little subscript that happens before verse 1. In this case, we read, "A psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah." And then he writes, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you." Now, if you're using a King James translation or one of the various translations in the name of King James, it doesn't use the word earnestly, it uses the word early. That's because the Hebrew word shares the same root, earnestly and early. The idea that we're going to see in this psalm is that David seeks God early, earnestly, all day and night. So it says there, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary." Now, I know the ESV here says, "So I have looked upon you." Most of your other modern translations are going to say it like I said it. David is saying that he has seen God. "I've seen you in the sanctuary." Now, the sanctuary back then was not a place where you'd go and get your nails done, like that's on 24th Street, nor is it a room like ours. At this particular point, the sanctuary was a tent where the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, resided. And what David is saying here is, when I go to church, so to speak, I have seen God. And while he was there, he beheld, continuing on in verse 2, "I beheld your power and your glory." How does that power and glory manifest itself to God's children? His love. And that's why David says in verse 3, "Because your steadfast, never-ending, inescapable love is better than life." Because your love, O God, is better than waking up in the morning and hugging your kids and enjoying the gifts that you've given to us, because your love is better than all of those things, my lips will praise you. I will bless you as long as I live. Every day of my life is the idea here. I will bless you as long as I live. In your name, I will lift up my hands. We might be embarrassed someday if Jesus walks through the door and we're singing and all of our hands are in our pockets. David knows something that a lot of us don't. He says, my soul, verse 5, my soul. And when the Hebrew talked about their soul, he's talking about his entire being, all that he is. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. David didn't spend his evening distracted with a phone. David spent his evenings, his time awake while he lay on his bed, thinking about God. I read that and I think to myself, good night. How many nights have I wasted? Verse 7, for you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul, that is everything that I am, clings to you. And your right hand upholds me. Let's pray, and we'll begin. Oh God, now that we find ourselves in your sanctuary, may we behold your glory in such a way that our souls will cling to you when we leave this place and we find ourselves in the wilderness. Amen. Now, Jesus, who is God, is better than anything and everything in every way. You hear that just about every week here at Cornerstone. That's because our mission at Cornerstone is to help each other flourish as we discover that he is better than everything in every way. Now, providentially, recently, after a sermon that I preached, a man from our congregation approached me after the service, and he said this. It's very insightful. He said, Pastor, I think everybody that comes to Cornerstone now knows that Jesus is better than everything in every way. But I don't think anybody knows how. It's a great observation. My reply to that statement is yes, you are absolutely right. That's actually why our purpose statement isn't just Jesus is better than everything in every way, though that is true. Instead, the purpose statement of our church is let's flourish together as we discover. As we discover that Jesus is better than everything in every way. Now, that discovering language in our purpose statement assumes our ignorance. It assumes that we don't know how that Jesus is better than whatever it is that we go running to at night. We come here on Sunday and we learn and we know in our minds that Jesus is better. But how do we go from knowing to experiencing? How do we go from hearing that he is better to experiencing that he is better? Let's face it. sitting in this sanctuary Sunday after Sunday, hearing that he is better than everything in every way, that can only accomplish so much. We can be compared to a room full of explorers sitting around in this room studying maps, preparing ourselves for a great exploration into an unknown wilderness. Now, the maps, they're just intellectual theory until we find ourselves in the wilderness. It's not until we leave the room and we find ourselves out in the wilderness that we discover the difference between theory and experience. It's the wilderness that teaches us the difference between knowing and knowing. In the room, we learn that Jesus is better. In the wilderness, we discover how. Church, the wilderness is essential. If we're being honest, the days that are good, man, when we experience the good times, the good days, it can be hard to believe that Jesus is better than whatever's making those days great. As a matter of fact, we might even be able to tap that whole day without thinking about him at all, because we're satisfied with something else. Who has time for Jesus when the days are good? But when the days are bad, when we find ourselves in the wilderness, there is nothing sweeter than Jesus. Now, King David, the man who wrote this psalm, he had it all. He had all the things this world tells you and I that we need if we want to be happy. He had all the ingredients to live a happy, satisfied life. He was handsome, so we had that in common. I had that in common with him. He was athletic. Don't get confused. We're talking about David here, okay? He was handsome. He was athletic. As a teenager, he killed lions and bears. Now, that's a story. He was Israel's savior against the Philistines when he was a teenager. And he killed that giant named Goliath. He instantly became a national hero, a military hero. I know this is wrong, but he had women. He had lots of women. He had kids. He had a family. He, as a matter of fact, fathered the wisest kid of all time. He could take pride in that son. Materialistically, he got whatever he wanted. He didn't have to covet on Amazon. He owned Amazon. He was an artist. He was a musician. He was a writer. He was a poet. As a matter of fact, his works are still being published today and the #1 bestseller of all time. We just so happen to be reading one of his poems this morning. David knew good days. David experienced the best of what this world has to offer, but not on this day. Not on Psalm 63 day. David is in the wilderness. The good days have left him. At this point in David's life, he's recently lost a baby. The baby died because of him. Imagine carrying the weight of that. Shortly after that, David's daughter, Tamar, she's raped. This little girl, teenage girl. And not by some brazen stranger, but by one of David's sons, Amnon. Parents' worst nightmare. To make matters worse, David's other son, Absalom, kills Amnon for raping his sister. Now David has 2 children who are dead. Sorrow upon sorrow upon sorrow. At this point, Absalom, he deserves the death penalty for killing his brother. But David, in an act of mercy, he decides not to take Absalom's life, but to banish him from Jerusalem, which means David is no longer going to get to see his son, his beloved son, Absalom. And he's devastated, depressed over it. Now, while Absalom's away, banished from Jerusalem, he gets angry. He gets mad at Dad. And he comes up with a plot to kill him. That's when David's forced to flee his home. That's when David finds himself in the wilderness. David is utterly devastated. And the cause of his devastation, the cause of his wilderness experience, is his very own dearly beloved son. In 2 Samuel 15:30, it tells us that David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot, with his head covered. You see, the man who had it all is now broken, barefoot, and bawling. Meanwhile, his son enters into David's house, and Absalom sets up a tent on the roof of Dad's house, and he rapes the 10 women that David had left at home to take care of things. And he does it on the roof so that way all of Jerusalem can see how he's shaming his father. When he's done, Absalom takes his army and he goes after his dad, who's now in the wilderness, and Absalom seeks to kill him. When David learns of Absalom's plan, he sends his army, David's army, to Absalom's army to stop the attack. But he gives very strict orders not to hurt Absalom. He tells his army, do not lay a finger on my son. You see, despite all of the heartache that David was experiencing as a father, he still longed to be reconciled to his dearly beloved son. As David's men chase Absalom on his horse, Absalom's head, it catches the thick lower branches of a great oak tree. So his head gets stuck in the branches, pulling his body from his horse, and so he's hanging there from the tree, suspended in midair. That's when one of David's men, Joab, ignores David's command, and he walks up to Absalom, and he takes not one, not two, but 3 spears and pushes them through his heart. When David hears the news, he falls as only a father who loves his son does. And he cries out, my son, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son. A psalm of David when he's in the wilderness. It's in this wilderness that David finds himself saying, oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you. It's in the literal wilderness of Judah and the painful wilderness of life that David turns not to riches, not to a vacation, not to pornography, not to a fake smile, not to anger, not to a bottle, but to God. Church, nothing in life satisfies like God. My soul thirsts. My flesh faints for you. Now, what's fascinating to me here, and don't miss this, is that David, he knows that God will satisfy him. He knows that God will satisfy him. And yet, God seems distant. He seems far away. Listen, you don't thirst for water if you're full of water. Just like you don't faint with desire for God if you're already satiated by God. He says, my flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there's no water. That's like saying, my flesh faints for God in a dry and weary land where there is no God. There's a huge point of application for us here. Sometimes in the wilderness, God feels far away. As we're stripped and robbed of the things that we love and like and enjoy, it can make us feel like God isn't there. That God is far from us. Like maybe he's abandoned us. Which makes us, or brings us to another very important point of application. As we're stripped of the things we love, house and home, food and family, health and comfort, as we're stripped of these things, what do you faint for? Because David fainted for God. Everything's been taken from him. Everything. And what is the one thing that his soul thirsts for, that his flesh faints for? It's God. You see, David's been told. He knows in his head that God is better than everything in every way, but it's in the wilderness where he's given the chance to experience it. Friend, your time in the wilderness is not God abandoning you. The wilderness is a gift. A gift where God teaches you that he and he alone can satisfy you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. We need the wilderness. You need the wilderness. You see, it's in the wilderness that we discover that whatever it is we run to, it's in the wilderness that we discover that whatever we think satisfies us more. It's in the wilderness that we discover that the porn or the diplomas or the piety or the health, they really aren't that great. God is great. Last Sunday, I was scheduled to preach, but I couldn't. I spent the whole week leading up to last Sunday in bed in tremendous pain. As I lied there on my bed, the Holy Spirit was reminding me that God was right there beside me. He's there in the wilderness, in the pain, ministering to me, watching over me. He loves me. He's there. He's in control. And suddenly, I didn't mind the pain so much. There was a sweet satisfaction in the wilderness. Perhaps no human being teaches us this more than Job. Job had it all. He was a good man. He sought to honor God, lead his family. God himself said that Job was righteous. Then one day, he's thrown out into the wilderness of heartache and loss unlike anybody I've ever met. His workers are murdered, his flocks destroyed, his business ruined, his kids killed, all in one afternoon. Job was utterly devastated. It's at that point he tears his clothes, he shaves his head, he covers his body in dust and ashes, he falls to the ground, and he worships God. That's how the book starts. And then we read of the days, the weeks, the months, while he's in the wilderness. His friends are no help. He has suicidal thoughts. He curses the day he was born. Job is in a dark, dark place. And then God speaks. God reveals himself so sweet, so powerful, so good to Job. He reveals himself in a way that Job never could have understood or experienced unless he were in the wilderness. And finally, we see Job speak once again in Job 42. And what's he say? He says, I know, God, that you can do all things, and the no purposes of yours can be stopped. And then he says this word, this loaded word. He says, before. Before what? Before this hell happened. Before everything was taken away. Before all that, I had heard of you with my ear. But now that I've been in the wilderness, now that I've walked through the hell, now that I've lost everything, now I don't hear of you with my ear, I see you with my eyes. Before the wilderness, I heard of you. But because of the wilderness, I know you. How do you go from knowing that Jesus is better than everything in every way to experiencing that Jesus is better? The wilderness. The wilderness. You mothers, on this Mother's Day, who have been or are now going through hell, know that the wilderness is where Jesus is sweeter than anywhere. And so don't waste the wilderness. Don't chase after other things. Faint for him. Faint. The fainting is worship. the hunger, the empty stomach, the thirsting is worship. Worship in the wilderness. Let's pray. O God, that we might know you like this. In time, according to your plan, teach us, not with our minds, but with our experience, that you are better than everything. In Jesus' name, amen.